Dorian Matthews was used to indifferent glances, casual dismissals, and people barely acknowledging his presence as he placed packages on reception desks. Nearly a decade of delivering goods in downtown Phoenix had taught him one thing: to most people, he was just part of the background, a nameless face in a uniform. Someone who blended in and didn't matter. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and he took pride in doing it well. Whitmore & Klein was one of his regular delivery spots. It was a high-end marketing firm located in a sleek office building with glass walls and luxurious interiors. But behind the polished exterior, the people working there had little regard for those they considered beneath them. Every time Dorian stepped inside, he could feel the coldness, the distance. To them, he wasn't worth noticing, or worse, he was someone to be dismissed from his very first delivery. He had sensed it. The receptionist barely glanced at him while signing for the package, already moving on to more important matters. The employees were absorbed in their laptops, overpriced coffee, and million-dollar marketing campaigns. They walked past him without so much as a nod. He was invisible to them. But one day, the contempt wasn't just silent, it was vocal. That afternoon, as he set a package down on the counter, a voice rang out behind him. "Can you imagine if the delivery guy was our boss?" Laughter erupted, followed by another mocking voice. "Please, he's probably used to lifting boxes, not leading meetings." Dorian didn't turn around, but he felt the words hit him like sharp blades. He recognized the first voice, Ryan Caldwell, a senior executive at the firm, always dressed in tailored suits, always cracking loud jokes to impress others. His words weren't just a joke. They carried a certainty, a belief that someone like Dorian could never be anything more than what they assumed. He handed the tablet to the receptionist, took it back without a word, and walked out. He had dealt with worse before, but this time, something was different. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was realization. They saw him as nothing more than a delivery man, and for the first time in a long while, that bothered him. As he reached the exit, he caught his reflection in the glass doors, his uniform, the delivery scanner clipped to his belt, his calloused hands from years of lifting boxes. That was all they saw, but they had no idea who he really was. Dorian sat in his van for a while, gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't angry, but he felt something stronger than anger, something sharper. It wasn't just the mockery, it was their absolute confidence that he was nothing more than his job that night. He called his older brother. "Malcolm, rough day?" Malcolm asked as he answered. "Not exactly," Dorian replied, "but something got me thinking." He told Malcolm about the laughter, the dismissive comments. Malcolm chuckled. "Let me guess, some rich folks acted like you didn't belong in their space. Nothing new." Right, but why does it feel different this time?" Dorian was silent for a moment. Then he said, "They don't just think I'm small, they are sure of it." Malcolm was quiet for a few seconds before he responded. "Good, that means you're finally tired of it." Dorian closed his eyes, memories flashing through his mind. He was never just a delivery guy. As a teenager, he had flipped sneakers for profit, buying limited editions and selling them at double or triple the price. Later, he got into investing, stocks, real estate, small businesses. He never talked about it, never flaunted it, but he had spent years learning, growing, and building. He had always known he was more than what people saw, and now, it was time to prove it. Dorian started researching Whitmore & Klein. It didn't take long to find cracks beneath the polished surface. The company was bleeding clients, losing major contracts, and struggling financially. It looked successful on the outside, but inside, it was crumbling. Using his business acumen, he reached out to investors, people who didn't care about his background but about his knowledge. He presented them with a plan to acquire and revive Whitmore & Klein. He showed him the firm's weaknesses and how he could turn it around. The investors believed in him. With their backing, he began acquiring shares, one by one, from those eager to sell before the company collapsed. Slowly, strategically, he gained control, and when the moment was right, he walked into Whitmore & Klein, not as a delivery man, but as the new owner that morning. The office felt different. Employees noticed something unusual. The familiar delivery guy had arrived, but without his uniform he walked straight into the CEO's office. Richard Langford, the company's longtime CEO, glanced up and smirked. "What do you want?" Dorian calmly placed a thick envelope on the desk. "It's about the fact that, as of this morning, I own Whitmore and Klein." Langford's smirk faded. He flipped through the documents, his face turning pale. "This is a joke," he muttered. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Dorian leaned back in his chair. "I think I'm your new boss." Langford slammed the papers down. "This firm isn't for sale." "It was," Dorian said smoothly. "You just didn't know it." The CEO was no longer a CEO. By the end of the day, he was packing up his office. Dorian called an emergency meeting with the entire company. Employees gathered in the conference room, whispering, confused. Ryan Caldwell, still oblivious, muttered to a colleague, "What is this, a security briefing?" The smirks vanished when Dorian stepped forward. "As of this morning," he announced, "I am the new majority owner of Whitmore and Klein." A stunned silence filled the room. Ryan let out a dry laugh. "You're joking?" Dorian met his gaze. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He placed the documents on the table. "If anyone has doubts, feel free to check the paperwork." Nobody moved. Dorian let the moment sink in before continuing. "I remember every joke, every insult, every time someone assumed I didn't belong here." His eyes flickered toward Ryan, then he dropped the bombshell. "Some of you won't be here for much longer." Murmurs spread. Some employees tensed, stealing nervous glances at one another. Ryan Caldwell scoffed. "You can't just." "I can." Dorian cut in. "And I will." Ryan clenched his jaw. Then, with a huff, he straightened his tie and stormed out. Dorian turned back to the employees. "If you want to build something great, you'll have a place here. If you're just here for a paycheck." He gestured to the door. By the time he walked out of the conference room, the energy in the office had shifted. Some employees looked stunned, others intrigued, and a few, just a few, looked inspired. This wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about proving that no one should ever be underestimated, because the person they dismissed today might be signing their paycheck tomorrow. Dorian Matthews had never let insults get to him. He had spent years brushing off dismissive glances, cold shoulders, and the subtle, sometimes outright, mockery that came with being a delivery man. He had learned early on that people tended to judge others based on appearance, social standing, and the job they held. It was a reality he had accepted. Or at least, he thought he had. But something about that day at Whitmore and Klein was different. The laughter, the certainty in their voices. It wasn't just a casual joke. They truly believed that someone like him, a man in a uniform carrying a delivery scanner, could never be more than that. The realization hit him harder than he expected as he climbed into his van. He gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the Phoenix skyline. The sun blazed over the city, bathing the glass buildings in gold, including the very office he had just walked out of. He wasn't angry. Anger was fleeting. This was something deeper. It was the unmistakable awareness that he had been thinking too small for far too long that night. After finishing his last delivery, he drove home to his small apartment in Mesa. It wasn't much, one bedroom, old carpeting, a kitchen with cabinets that had seen better days. But it was his. He sat there in the dark for a long while, gripping the wheel, lost in thought. He had told himself for years that it didn't matter what others thought of him. As long as he worked hard and made an honest living, that was enough. But now, that logic wasn't holding up. The employees at Whitmore and Klein didn't just see him as unimportant. They saw him as incapable. Their laughter wasn't ignorance, it was confidence. A belief that a man like him could never be in their position. That night, he needed to talk to someone. He pulled out his phone and called the one person who had always understood him, his older brother. Malcolm. The phone barely rang twice before Malcolm picked up. "Yo, you good?" Dorian exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Yeah, just had one of those days." Malcolm chuckled knowingly. "Let me guess. Some rich folks made you feel like you weren't supposed to be in their space. Dorian hesitated. Something like that. Malcolm didn't rush him to explain. He never did. He just waited. That was how he had always been, patient, thoughtful, never one to push. They laughed. Dorian finally said, his voice quieter than before. Outright laughed at the idea of me being anything more than a delivery guy. Malcolm went silent for a moment before responding with something unexpected. Good. Dorian frowned. Good, yeah, it means you're finally tired of it. Dorian leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling. What am I supposed to do? Quit my job because a couple of idiots don't respect me? Nah, Malcolm said. You're smarter than that. Smarter than them, too. Dorian let the words sink in. His brother wasn't saying anything he didn't already know. But hearing it out loud, from someone who truly believed in him, made it feel different. He had always been good with numbers. Strategy. At 16, he had turned a couple of $100 into a few thousand flipping sneakers. Later, he moved on to buying and selling used cars. Learning how to negotiate, how to spot a deal before anyone else did. He had invested in stocks, put money into small businesses. He never talked about it, never flaunted it, but he watched, he learned, he built, and over the past year, something even bigger had been brewing. Dorian had been sitting on a business proposal that had caught the attention of serious investors, people who didn't care about where he came from or what he did for a living. Only about what he knew. They saw his potential, they saw how he analyzed businesses, spotting their weak points, understanding their value before anyone else did. And now, they were ready to back him for months. Dorian had been meeting with investors in the evenings after long shifts, late nights spent on Zoom calls, poring over financial statements, refining his strategy. He had already helped turn around 2 struggling businesses. Quietly, efficiently. Whitmore and Klein had no idea. But he had been watching them closely. They looked successful on the surface. But their financials told a different story. They were losing clients, failing to adapt, relying on reputation rather than results. Their leadership was out of touch. Their strategies outdated. They were bleeding money, and their debt was catching up with them. Dorian knew the company better than they thought. And he knew exactly when to strike. One evening, he met with his lead investor, Anthony Wells, in a private lounge at a downtown hotel. The place was sleek, leather chairs, dim lighting, the quiet hum of business deals being made over expensive whiskey. Wells, a sharp, no-nonsense businessman who had built his fortune in commercial real estate, studied Dorian over his espresso. So tell me again, Wells said, setting his cup down. Why Whitmore and Klein? Dorian leaned forward. Because they're in trouble, and they don't even realize how bad it is. Wells raised an eyebrow. Explain. Dorian pulled a folder from his briefcase, flipping it open on the table. They've been bleeding clients for the past year. Bad leadership, outdated strategies, spending money in the wrong places. They look successful on the surface, but their debt load is suffocating them. He tapped the papers. I give it 6 months before they either downsize or sell. Wells studied the numbers, flipping through the pages. You sure about this? Dorian nodded. I've been watching them for a while. Their biggest accounts are pulling back. Their client retention is dropping, and they have no idea how to fix it. Wells smirked. And you want to be the one to buy them out? Dorian didn't hesitate. I don't just want to buy them. I want to turn them around, restructure, cut the dead weight, bring in fresh talent, and make them profitable again. Wells sat back, tapping his fingers against the table. It's a bold move. It's a smart move, Dorian corrected. Wells chuckled, then reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a check and slid it across the table. Dorian looked down at it. The amount was exactly what he needed to make the first move. You've got my backing, Wells said. Don't make me regret it. Dorian picked up the check, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. The people who had laughed at him had no idea they were mocking their future boss. And soon, they were going to find out the hard way. Dorian Matthews had spent months preparing for this moment. It hadn't been easy. Acquiring a struggling company while working full-time as a delivery man was no small feat. But he had done it. With the help of investors who believed in his vision, he had quietly secured the majority stake in Whitmore and Klein. The employees had no idea what was coming. They still saw him as just another worker passing through. That illusion was about to be shattered. The morning of the takeover, Dorian sent an email to Richard Langford, the current CEO of Whitmore and Klein. The subject line was simple: immediate discussion required. Langford's assistant, Ellen, blinked when she saw the sender's name. She had seen Dorian delivering packages to the office countless times. Why was he emailing the CEO directly? She hesitated before knocking on Langford's office door. "Sir, I just received an urgent email from Dorian Matthews." Langford barely looked up from his computer. "Who?" Ellen swallowed. "The delivery man." Langford scoffed, shaking his head. "The guy from the lobby? What could he possibly want? He's requesting an immediate meeting." Langford sighed in frustration. Profits were already sinking, and their biggest client had just pulled their contract. The last thing he had time for was nonsense. "Fine," he muttered. "Bring him in. Let's get this joke over with." Minutes later, Dorian stepped into the office, this time not in his delivery uniform. Langford barely glanced at him. "All right, what's this about?" Dorian calmly placed a thick envelope on the desk. "This is about the fact that, as of this morning, I own the majority of Whitmore and Klein." Langford finally looked up. He frowned, then let out a dry laugh. "You?" he scoffed. "That's impossible." Dorian didn't blink. "Check the paperwork." Langford hesitated, then grabbed the envelope. As he flipped through the documents, his face turned pale. He read, then reread, as if searching for some mistake. But there was no mistake. His hands trembled slightly as he looked back up. This can't be real." "It's very real," Dorian said smoothly. Langford slammed the papers down. "This firm isn't for sale." Dorian leaned back. "It was. You just didn't know it." Langford opened his mouth, then closed it again. He turned back to the documents, checking the numbers, the signatures. But no matter how many times he looked, the truth didn't change. He wasn't the CEO anymore. Dorian stood up. "I'll give you until the end of the day to clear out your office." Langford stared at him, speechless. Dorian turned toward the door but paused before leaving. He glanced back over his shoulder. "Oh, and Richard," he said with a small smile. "Don't worry. I'm sure there's a delivery job out there for you somewhere." Langford's face flushed red, his jaw tightening in fury. But there was nothing he could do. As Dorian walked through the office, whispers spread like wildfire. Employees shot each other confused glances. The receptionist, who had barely acknowledged him for years, suddenly sat up straighter. Inside the conference room, the senior staff gathered, unaware of what was about to happen. Ryan Caldwell, the executive who had mocked Dorian not long ago, leaned toward a colleague. "What is this?" he muttered. "A security briefing." His friend smirked. "Maybe they're laying off the cleaning crew." The jokes stopped the moment Dorian stepped forward. He looked around the room, letting the silence stretch. Some employees looked confused, others impatient. A few, like Ryan, still looked amused. Dorian finally spoke. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I called this meeting." A few exchanged glances. "As of this morning," he continued, "I am the new majority owner of Whitmore and Klein." A stunned silence fell over the room. Someone let out a nervous laugh, expecting a punchline. None came. Ryan crossed his arms, still smirking. "You're joking." Dorian met his gaze. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The smirk faded. Dorian set a thick stack of documents on the table, the financials, the contracts, every signed deal that had made this possible. "If anyone has doubts, feel free to take a look." Nobody moved. The weight of reality sank in. The man they had ignored, the man they had laughed at, was now their boss. Dorian took a deep breath and spoke again. "I've worked in this building for years. Most of you never noticed me. Some of you did, and made sure I knew exactly what you thought of me." His gaze flickered briefly toward Ryan. "I remember every joke, every insult, every time someone assumed I didn't belong." Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "But I also remember something else," Dorian continued. I remember watching this company make mistake after mistake. I remember seeing potential wasted because leadership refused to adapt. And I remember thinking that if I ever got the chance, I would do things differently. He took a step forward. That chance is now. A nervous energy filled the room. Some employees unfolded their arms. Others straightened their posture. Dorian let his next words land with precision. Things are about to change. Some of you won't like it. Some of you won't be here for it. A ripple of unease spread across the room. Dorian let the tension settle before continuing. But for those of you willing to work, willing to be part of something stronger, something better, you'll have a place here. He let his eyes sweep across the room one last time. This is not the same company it was yesterday. And it's definitely not the same company it was when I walked in here as a delivery man. Another pause. If you don't like that, there's the door. The weight of his words settled over the employees. Some looked nervous, others uncertain, but for the first time, they realized that Whitmore and Klein had changed. And so had Dorian Matthews. The air in Whitmore and Klein was thick with tension. The weight of what had just happened settled like a heavy fog over the employees gathered in the conference room. Dorian Matthews, the man they had laughed at, dismissed, and ignored, now stood at the front of the room, owning not just the space, but the entire company for the first time in years. He wasn't just passing through. He was in charge. Dorian watched as the employees processed his words. Some were still in shock, exchanging glances with colleagues as if silently confirming that this wasn't a joke. Others looked uncomfortable, realizing that the dynamic of the company had shifted overnight. A few, particularly the junior employees who had been overlooked for years, seemed intrigued, perhaps even hopeful. Then, as expected, Ryan Caldwell broke the silence. He let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This is insane," he muttered. "You can't be serious." Dorian turned his gaze to him, unwavering. "Do you think I'd be standing here saying all this if I wasn't serious?" Ryan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "So, what? You walk in here, throw your weight around, and expect us to just fall in line?" Dorian took a step closer. "No, I expect you to do your job. If you can't handle that, you're free to leave." Ryan scoffed. "Right, because you, of all people, are suddenly the expert on running a company like this." Dorian didn't flinch. His voice was calm but firm. "I know this company better than you think, Ryan. I've spent years watching the arrogance, the wasted potential, the outdated strategies, and I've spent even more years learning how to run businesses successfully." Ryan clenched his jaw. "You're making a mistake." "No," Dorian said simply. "The mistake was assuming I didn't belong here." A murmur rippled through the room. Some employees shifted uncomfortably, while others looked at Ryan, waiting for his response. Dorian didn't give him a chance to regain control. "Let's talk about mistakes," he said, reaching for a folder from the stack on the table. He flipped it open and scanned the contents before looking up. "Ryan, since you have so much to say, maybe you'd like to explain why your department is responsible for one of the largest client losses in this company's history." Ryan's face darkened. "That's not, it is." Dorian cut in smoothly. "And I have the reports to prove it. Overpromising, under-delivering, failing to adjust strategies when the market shifted." He tapped the folder. "The client walked and took millions in revenue with them." Ryan's face burned red. Dorian shut the folder. "So if we're questioning who deserves to be here, I'd say you have more to answer for than I do." The room was dead silent. Ryan's mouth opened as if he wanted to argue. But he didn't, because he knew the numbers didn't lie. Dorian let the silence stretch for a moment before addressing the rest of the room. "This is the part where some of you start to panic," he said, "where you start wondering if you're about to lose your jobs." More murmurs. More stolen glances. "And the answer is, some of you will." That got their attention. Dorian gestured toward the stack of documents in front of him. "I've already done my research. I know who brings value to this company. I know who's been coasting by. And I know who's been taking credit for other people's work." Some employees visibly tensed. Others darted quick glances at their colleagues, as if suddenly realizing the consequences of their office politics. There's dead weight in this company. Dorian continued. And I don't carry dead weight. If you're here to work, to contribute, to help rebuild something better, you have nothing to worry about. But if you're here just to collect a paycheck and keep up appearances. He shrugged. You won't last long. He let that settle before delivering the final blow. I'll be sending out termination notices by the end of the day. The room felt like it had lost all its oxygen. Ryan took a step forward. Desperation creeping into his voice. You can't just. I can. Dorian said simply. And I will. Ryan clenched his fists. His pride wouldn't let him be the first to back down. He straightened his tie, lifted his chin. Fine. He spat. If this is how it's going to be, then I quit. Dorian met his stare. That's the first good decision you've made in years, Ryan scoffed, shaking his head. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the conference room. Slamming the door behind him, a heavy silence followed. Dorian let the moment breathe. Then turned back to the rest of the staff. For those of you still here, remember this. Whitmore and Klein isn't just going to survive. It's going to become something better than it ever was before. But that only happens if the right people are in place. He let his gaze sweep across the room, taking in their reactions, some nervous, some determined, some still struggling to grasp what had just happened. If you're willing to step up, to work, to actually build something meaningful, you'll have a place here. He paused. But if you're only here because you think you deserve to be, because you're comfortable, because you assume nothing will change. He gestured toward the door. You can follow Ryan. The room remained silent. But this time, it wasn't shock. It was realization things had changed. Dorian wasn't the man they had dismissed anymore. And from this moment forward, he never would be again. By the time Dorian left the conference room, the energy in the office had completely shifted. Some employees sat at their desks in stunned silence. Others whispered in hushed voices, stealing glances at the man they had ignored for years. Some looked afraid, others looked intrigued, and a few, just a few, looked inspired. But Dorian didn't let any of it affect him. He had done what needed to be done. Now, the real work began as he stepped into what was now his office, formerly Langford's. He let out a slow breath. The space was bigger than he had expected. Leather furniture, bookshelves lined with unread business books, a massive oak desk that probably cost more than his first car. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. This moment was supposed to feel different. He had spent years working toward this, fighting against every assumption, every dismissal, every moment of being underestimated. He had made it. He had proven him wrong, and yet, standing here, staring at the skyline, he realized something. This wasn't about revenge. It had never been about that. If it was, the satisfaction would have already faded. He would have felt the high of watching Ryan storm out, of seeing the shock on their faces, but that wasn't what drove him. He had done this because he knew he could build something better. Not just for himself, but for the people in that office who had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, just like he had been. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Ellen, Langford's former assistant, stepped inside hesitantly. Everything all right? She asked. Dorian turned from the window and nodded. Just getting used to the view. The air in Whitmore and Klein had shifted. The tension that had filled the building only hours ago had given way to an uneasy silence. Employees whispered in hushed voices, stealing cautious glances at the man who had once been their delivery guy, now their boss. Dorian Matthews had spent years being overlooked in this office. Now, every eye was on him as he stepped into what was now his office, formerly occupied by Richard Langford. He let out a slow breath. The space was grander than he had expected. Leather furniture, bookshelves lined with unread business books, and a massive oak desk that probably cost more than his first car. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. He had spent years working toward this moment. He had fought against every assumption, every dismissal, every moment of being underestimated. He had finally made it. But as he stood there, taking it all in, he realized something. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. If revenge had been his motivation, he would have already felt satisfied. Watching Ryan Caldwell storm out of the office, seeing the disbelief on the employees' faces, knowing that the very people who once mocked him were now answering to him. Those things might have brought a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but that wasn't what drove him. Dorian hadn't fought for this just to prove them wrong. He had done this because he believed he could build something better, not just for himself, but for the people in this company who had been overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued. Just like he had been, there were talented people in this building. People with ideas. People who had been held back by poor leadership, by outdated systems, by a company that valued prestige over progress. Under the right leadership, Whitmore and Klein could be something great, and under the wrong leadership, it would have continued its slow decline. That was what mattered. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Ellen, Langford's former assistant, stepped inside. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Everything all right?" she asked. Dorian turned from the window and nodded. "Just getting used to the view." She gave a small smile. "I imagine it looks a lot different from this side." He studied her for a moment. She wasn't like the others. She had been in this company long enough to see its rise, its mistakes, and its slow decline. "I have a question for you," he said. Ellen folded her arms. "All right. Why are you still here?" She considered his words carefully before responding. "Because I love what this place used to be," she said, "and I think, under the right leadership, it could be that again." Dorian nodded slowly. Ellen hesitated. "If I'm being honest, I didn't expect this. I've seen a lot of CEOs come and go, but I never thought I'd see this company end up in your hands." Dorian chuckled. "Neither did they," she exhaled, shaking her head with a small smirk. "Well," she said, "Langford's gone. Ryan quit. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. There always is when change happens." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, for what it's worth, I think this place could use some change." Dorian smirked. "Then let's get to work." Over the next few days, the real work began. Dorian spent long hours reviewing the company's financials, analyzing departments, identifying weaknesses, and meeting with employees. He wanted to understand the problems firsthand, not just from reports, but from the people who had been dealing with them daily. Some employees were hesitant to speak. Others, emboldened by the sudden shift in leadership, were brutally honest about what had been going wrong. What Dorian learned was exactly what he had suspected. The company had been operating on outdated strategies, relying on reputation rather than results. Clients had been leaving due to poor management and a lack of innovation. Talented employees had been overlooked, while underperformers in senior positions had been allowed to coast by unchecked. Budgets had been mismanaged, with excessive spending in areas that didn't bring returns. Dorian wasn't just here to replace a CEO. He was here to rebuild the entire system. His first order of business was restructuring the leadership team. He called a meeting with department heads and senior executives, those who were left. Anyway, Ryan's departure had left a vacancy, and others had already resigned. Sensing that they would be next, Dorian sat at the head of the conference table, letting the silence settle before speaking. "This company has been running on borrowed time," he said. "That time is up." Some executives shifted uncomfortably. Others sat stiffly, waiting for what was coming next. Dorian continued, "This isn't about maintaining appearances. This isn't about keeping things the way they were. We are going to rebuild this company from the ground up. That means new strategies, new leadership, and new standards." He let that sink in before adding, "Some of you will be part of that future. Some of you won't." Murmurs spread around the table. Dorian leaned forward. "If you've been coasting by, if you've been relying on outdated tactics, if you've been taking credit for other people's work, this is your warning. Things are changing, and if you're not willing to step up, you won't last here." Silence. "Now," he said, "let's get to work." Over the next few weeks, the changes were felt across the company. Underperforming senior staff were removed. Promising employees who had been overlooked were given opportunities to prove themselves. New strategies were implemented to regain client trust and bring in fresh business. Financial waste was cut, redirecting resources where they actually mattered. Some employees resisted the changes at first. Some left voluntarily, but those who remained saw something different. A company that was finally moving in the right direction, and they saw something different in Dorian. 2. He wasn't just a businessman who had taken over, he was a leader months later. Whitmore and Klein looked nothing like the company it had been. The toxic culture that had allowed arrogance to thrive was gone. The complacency that had driven clients away had been replaced with real innovation. The firm wasn't just surviving, it was growing. One afternoon, as Dorian walked through the office, he overheard a conversation between two junior employees. He used to be a delivery guy. One whispered, "And now he owns the company." The other nodded. "Yeah, crazy, right?" Dorian paused for a moment, then smiled. It wasn't crazy, it was proof that no one should ever be underestimated based on where they start, because one day they just might be the one signing your paycheck. Whitmore and Klein was no longer the company it had once been. The sleek office floors, the glass-walled conference rooms, and the marble-clad reception area all remained the same, but the energy inside had shifted. The arrogance, the complacency, and the outdated leadership were gone. In their place was a company that was leaner, sharper, and more ambitious than ever before. At the center of it all stood Dorian Matthews, the man who had once been ignored in these very halls. Now the one shaping their future. It had been months since the takeover, and though the dust had settled, the transformation was far from over. Dorian sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. Revenue was climbing, client retention had improved, the firm had not only stabilized, it was growing. He knew that wasn't just because of him. It was because of the changes he had made, because of the right people he had chosen to keep, and the deadweight he had removed. Still, there was always more work to be done. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. Ellen stepped inside, holding a folder. "Final list of candidates for the new marketing director," she said, placing it on his desk. Dorian flipped through the names. He recognized some former employees of Whitmore and Klein who had either left or been pushed out during the transition. Others were fresh talent, people he had never worked with before. He set the folder down and looked at Ellen. "What do you think?" She tilted her head. "Considering, I think you already know who you want." He smirked. "Maybe." Ellen sat across from him. "You know, people still talk about how all of this happened," she said, gesturing around the office. "About how you went from delivering packages to owning the company." Dorian chuckled. "Let me guess, they say it was a crazy, impossible story?" She nodded. "Pretty much." He leaned back in his chair, looking out the window. "It wasn't impossible," he said, "people just never saw it coming." One of the most drastic changes Dorian had implemented was the company culture. Before, Whitmore and Klein had thrived on hierarchy. The senior executives made all the decisions, often ignoring the voices of the people who actually did the work. Promotions were based on office politics, not ability. Talented employees were overlooked in favor of those who fit the mold. That was no longer the case. Dorian had established a new standard: performance over tenure. No one kept their job just because they had been there for years. If they weren't delivering results, they were replaced. Innovation over tradition. Just because something had worked in the past didn't mean it would work forever. The firm embraced fresh ideas, new technologies, and creative approaches. Respect over arrogance. The culture of looking down on others, whether they were entry-level employees or outside workers, was no longer tolerated. Some people had struggled with the new reality. Others had left, unwilling to adapt, but those who remained thrived. One afternoon, as Dorian made his way through the office, he spotted a familiar face in the lobby. Richard Langford, the former CEO, stood near the entrance, looking around the office he had once ruled. When he saw Dorian, he hesitated for a moment, then walked over. Dorian crossed his arms. "Didn't expect to see you here." Langford let out a breath. "I almost didn't come, but I wanted to see it for myself." "See what?" Langford looked around, watching the employees, engaged, productive, and, for the first time in years, actually invested in their work. "This," he said, "the company, the way it is now." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "And?" Langford was silent for a moment. Then, with a small nod, he admitted, "You did what I couldn't." Dorian studied him. searching for any trace of sarcasm or bitterness. But there was none. He didn't need Langford's validation. But hearing it, nonetheless, was a reminder of how far he had come. A few weeks later, Dorian was invited to speak at a business conference. It was a panel on leadership and innovation, an opportunity that, months ago, he never would have imagined himself in. As he took the stage, he looked out at the audience. Executives, entrepreneurs, investors, people who had spent their careers in boardrooms, not in delivery vans, and yet they were here to hear from him. When the moderator turned to him with the first question, she asked, "Your story is one of the most remarkable transformations in business. What would you say is the key lesson you've learned from all of it?" Dorian thought for a moment before answering. "If there's one thing I've learned," he said, "it's that people will always underestimate you until you show them they shouldn't." He let that sink in before continuing. "People saw me as just a delivery guy because that's all they chose to see. They never looked deeper. They never asked themselves if there was more to me than the uniform I wore." He glanced around the room. "And that's not just about me. It's about everyone. How often do we look at someone and assume we know their worth just because of their job title, their background, or their appearance?" He shook his head. "The truth is, talent exists everywhere. Potential exists everywhere. The only question is whether we recognize it or dismiss it." A murmur of agreement spread through the audience. Dorian leaned forward. "Never underestimate someone just because of where they start. Because one day, they might be the ones signing your paycheck." Back at the office, things continued to evolve. The company had grown stronger than ever before, with a reputation that extended far beyond its industry. Clients who had once doubted its survival were now eager to work with it again. And Dorian Matthews, he was no longer just the man who had taken over Whitmore and Klein. He was a leader, a visionary, and a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to accept the limits others placed on them. One afternoon, as he walked past a group of junior employees, he overheard one of them whispering to another, "Can you believe he used to be a delivery guy?" The other nodded. "Yeah, crazy, right?" Dorian smiled to himself. It wasn't crazy, it was proof that no one's potential should ever be measured by where they start, because where they end up, that's entirely up to them.